Adam Capay will have his latest day in court. In 2012, Capay was placed into what Corrections Canada calls, quote, administrative segregation for allegedly killing another inmate at the Thunder Bay Correctional Facility. 4 years later, with his case stalled in the courts, he still spends 23 hours a day in his cell. Segregating inmates is a controversial practice, and just last year, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ordered his Justice Minister to begin implementing recommendations to end it. Joining me now to weigh in on administrative segregation is Lee Chappell, who spent 21 years in the Canadian correctional system and is now the president of Canadian Prison Consulting. Lisa Kerr is a professor of law at Queen's University with a focus on sentencing. And in Thunder Bay is Michael Lundy, a correctional officer at the Thunder Bay District Jail. Thanks to all three of you for being here this morning. I want to start with you, Lee, because you spent time in solitary confinement, both at the federal and the provincial levels. There's a distinction between both those levels, isn't there?
There's a considerable distinction, yes, there is. The federal system, if you are in administrative segregation, you could have things such as televisions, a little bit of, a few different things that you don't see in provincial. Provincial is as barren as it gets. So considerable differences, I think, from top to bottom in federal provincial.
Is there a reason why there's no harmony in these two systems?
Well, the provincial system is designed as an entry point and is typically 60% of Ontario inmates in provincial are serving pre-trial time, so they're not convicted of a crime. Essentially we went to a super jail model in the year 2000, which is modeled after the American system, and our federal system is more static. There's more of a vested interest in the federal system. People are there longer, and it just works a little more effectively.
Lisa, you've said that you found that the conditions for prisoners varies not just between federal and provincial facilities, but from prison to prison. Is that variation part of the problem?
It's a big part of the problem. And what we do know, though, is that whether you're in a provincial jail or a federal penitentiary, that the law currently allows inmates to be segregated for up to 23 hours a day. So it's true that access to reading material, access to fresh air, those things vary. But the law allows that 23-hour-a-day cellular confinement.
Michael, as a correctional officer, under what circumstances would an inmate legitimately warrant administrative segregation?
Well, there's usually three things that'll warrant a long time in administrative seg: danger to themselves, danger to staff, or danger to other inmates.
As a follow-up there, Michael, are there cases where an inmate doesn't warrant administrative segregation, but you have no choice but to put them there anyway?
Yes, for sure. They can't survive in the general population type area. And the problem with Ontario corrections is we really don't have a lot of go-betweens, like step-down areas.
So it's a lack of resources?
Yes.
So, Lisa, with that mention of lack of resources that prison staff has to deal with, have you found that a lack of resources was also part of the reason that prison officials dole out unwarranted segregation? What else contributes to that problem?
Well, I do think lack of resources is a big part of the problem, but I also think that segregation is sometimes used in a punitive way. It's sometimes used as a response to a mental health problem. And that's because the law is so discretionary in this area. It doesn't govern the practice very closely. And so that means that there's a real range of reasons that it gets used, and some are legitimate and some are very petty and illegitimate.
Lee, let's talk about some of those legitimate reasons. What would be a valid reason? What would be something you'd say, okay, I can get on board with solitary confinement for this particular reason?
Historically, inmates were very cognizant of the fact that if they were to have an infraction, a fight, a murder, for example, of another inmate, any sort of assault or drug subculture charges typically would result in a short period of segregation.
I want to talk about, let's ask Lisa, what are you seeing, what is, I'm sorry, let me start over. What is a situation that you would agree with and say this is a good excuse for solitary confinement?
Well, in the federal system, for example, there's a distinction between disciplinary and administrative segregation, and disciplinary segregation is properly used where an inmate violates a specific prison rule. They get a hearing, they get access to a lawyer, they get the benefit of reasonable doubt, and if they are found guilty of breaching a prison rule, they get a maximum 30-day placement in segregation. What we're really talking about in the Adam Capay case and in these other cases of extraordinarily long and abusive terms of segregation is we're talking about administrative segregation, and that can be imposed for any reason related to the safety and security of the institution. And the interpretation of what that means is really up to actors on the ground. So, we're really talking about a highly general, indefinite period of segregation that can be imposed.
Michael, you are the boots on the ground in this situation. Could a prison function without any kind of segregation?
Absolutely not. It would be a danger to the health and safety of the institution. You have to remember, we want to use segregation as a disciplinary tool. That's at the end of the day what Ontario Corrections wants to do. We want the resources to be able to house people that don't belong in segregation in different areas.
Michael, I wanted to pick up about what Lisa said before, but sometimes it's used as, when you have no resources in dealing with a mental illness. Do you find that that's the case where you work?
Yes, absolutely. And I can speak for pretty much most of Ontario Corrections. That's the case.
Lastly, Justice Minister Judy Wilson-Raybould is implementing recommendations to reform solitary confinement. Now, I'll put this to the three of you. If you could make recommendations to the minister about what needs to be done to fix this issue and this system, what would those recommendations be? We're going to start with you, Lisa.
Well, I think and to pick up on this last point, I think there's an important distinction between segregation and separation of inmates. It's fair enough that we're going to need to separate inmates from one another, from the general population, for a variety of reasons. What's not necessary is to place an inmate in a cell for 23 hours a day. Separate an inmate from the general population, but why not get them 6 hours out of their cell each day, some access to the yard, some real visits, some real human contact? So I do think that the federal Liberal government is very committed to reforming this issue in a real way, and that's after 30 years of inaction by the federal government. But it's really eliminating that reliance on isolation, right? And instead achieving separation where legitimate without that form of human suffering that follows from isolation.
Michael, what about you? What recommendations would you give to the minister? I agree 100% with what the previous speaker said. However, it comes back to resources. It's all great to have someone out of their cell for 6 hours a day, and we agree. We agree there should be more liberties. However, without the staff resources, it's no different than what the areas that we've moved them in for their own protection or for other inmates' protection or for staff protection.
Lee, the final word is going to be yours. What recommendation would you offer the minister?
Well, to Lisa's point, the recommendation what I am advocating for, and I have recommended to our governments, is that we put a lot more emphasis on the front end intake, reception in our prisons, to get ahead of this. I mean, if we do something that breaks it down so that we have compatible people in the same areas and a real strong reception intake process where there's orientation that takes place, where you can filter inmates, I think it would benefit the guards on the front line with their job, and I think it would certainly benefit our inmate populations.
Well, thank you to the three of you for joining us on what I believe is a very important discussion to have. We appreciate your time this morning.